The gavel struck the worn oak block with the grim finality of a coffin nailing shut. For exactly $185, every last crumpled bill and copper penny of his life savings, Sergio Grant had just purchased the laughingstock of Black Hawk County. Locals called it the Devil's Dustpan. 40 acres of cracked, sour earth where nothing had grown for decades but misery, creeping weeds, and rusted plow blades. The gathered townsfolk whispered that Sergio was either a desperate madman or an utter fool. But beneath that desolate, barren Iowa dirt lay a secret that had been deliberately buried for half a century. What happened next wouldn't just silence the mocking crowds, it would shake the very foundations of the town. The air inside the Black Hawk County courthouse was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the unmistakable, suffocating odor of desperation. It was October 1933. And the Great Depression had long since wrapped its bony fingers around the throat of the American Midwest. Farms were failing by the dozens, foreclosed upon by ruthless banks and auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to men who already had too much. Sergio Grant stood near the back of the crowded room, his broad shoulders stooped beneath a faded canvas coat that had seen better days a decade ago. His calloused hands, stained permanently with grease and topsoil, were shoved deep into his pockets, clutching a small, heavy canvas sack. Inside that sack was his entire future. At the front of the room stood Mayor Thomas Higgins, doubling as the county auctioneer for the day. Higgins was a portly man with a red face and a voice that boomed like a bass drum. He wiped his sweating forehead with a checkered handkerchief and cleared his throat. Next on the docket, Higgins announced, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceiling, we have the old Miller tract, 40 acres out on the eastern ridge. Now, I won't sugarcoat it, folks. We all know the land. We all know its history, but the county needs the back taxes settled. Opening bid is set at $50. A collective murmur of amusement rippled through the crowd. Men in worn overalls shook their heads, spitting tobacco juice into brass spittoons. $50, called out a voice from the front row. It belonged to Harlan Brooks. Harlan was the wealthiest landowner in the county, a man who had spent the last 4 years devouring bankrupt family farms to add to his massive agricultural empire. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place among the starving farmers. Higgins, you couldn't pay me $50 to take that cursed patch of rocks. Nothing's grown there since old man Miller lost his mind and salted his own fields back in '98. Laughter erupted in the gallery. Higgins sighed, slamming his gavel lightly. Quiet down, quiet down. Do I hear $50? Do I hear 30? Come on, gentlemen. Someone must want a place to bury their garbage. Sergio felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought of his wife, Martha, waiting back at the rented boarding house room with their meager belongings packed into 2 cardboard suitcases. He thought of the eviction notice that had forced them out of their tenant farming gig just 3 days prior. They had nowhere to go. No land, no home, no prospects. $185, Sergio said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden, stunned silence that fell over the courthouse, it rang out like a gunshot. Heads turned, hundreds of eyes fixed upon the tall, gaunt figure at the back of the room. Harlan Brooks turned in his front row seat, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in Sergio's threadbare appearance. Who the hell is that? Brooks muttered to the man beside him. Sergio Grant, Higgins said, peering over his reading glasses. Sergio, you are bidding $185 on the Miller tract? The entire sum? You understand there are no refunds, and the land is sold strictly as is? I understand, Sergio said, stepping forward. He walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for him as if he were carrying a contagious disease. He reached the auction block and placed the heavy canvas sack onto the wood. It landed with a dull, metallic clink. Count it. Higgins hesitated, then untied the sack. He poured the contents onto the table, a pathetic but hard-won mountain of crinkled single-dollar bills, worn $5 notes, silver quarters, and tarnished pennies. It took the mayor and a clerk 10 agonizing minutes to count it out while the crowd watched in morbid fascination. Exactly $185, Higgins finally announced, looking at Sergio with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel slammed down. The deed was done. As Sergio turned to leave, clutching the freshly stamped property deed in his calloused hand, Harlan Brooks stepped into his path. Brooks smelled of expensive bay rum aftershave and fine cigars. You're a fool, Grant, Brooks said, his voice dripping with condescension. I know your situation. You're broke. You just gave the county your last dime for 40 acres of poison. That land is a graveyard. It's steep, it's rocky, and the soil is so acidic it burns the roots off weeds. You'll be starved to death before the first snow. Sergio looked down at the wealthy man. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained stoic. It's my land now, Mr. Brooks. I'll take my chances. Suit yourself, Brooks sneered, stepping aside. When you're freezing in that collapsed shack out there, don't come begging to my door for scraps. Sergio walked out of the courthouse and into the biting autumn wind. The sky was a bruised, gunmetal gray, threatening early snow. He had the deed. He had 40 acres. But as he walked back to the boarding house to tell Martha what he had done, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He had heard the stories about the Miller Tract just like everyone else. He knew he had just bought the worst piece of real estate in the state of Iowa. He just prayed that hard work could fix what history had broken. The journey to the eastern ridge took 3 hours by foot, with Sergio pulling a borrowed, rickety wooden handcart holding all their earthly possessions, and Martha walking beside him, her face wrapped against the biting wind. When they finally crested the hill and looked down upon their new home, Martha let out a quiet, stifled gasp. The Devil's Dustpan was worse than the rumors. It was a jagged, ugly scar on the otherwise rolling, beautiful Iowa landscape. The 40 acres sat in a bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by steep, rocky inclines that blocked the morning sun. The soil wasn't the rich, dark loam of the Midwest. It was a sickly, pale gray, cracked and fissured like dried clay. At the center of the depression stood the remains of a farmhouse. The roof had caved in years ago, leaving skeletal, rotting rafters pointing accusatorily at the sky. Next to it was a collapsed barn and a rusted, broken windmill that creaked mournfully in the wind. "Sergio," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "I know," Sergio said, dropping the handles of the cart. He didn't look at her, ashamed of the tears prickling the corners of his own eyes. "It looks bad, but we'll fix the roof on the kitchen side tonight. There's a wood stove still inside," they said. "We can make it warm." The first week was a brutal education in suffering. The soil was as hard as concrete. When Sergio took a pickaxe to it, sparks flew as iron met hidden stones. He worked from dawn until dusk, trying to clear a half-acre patch for a late-season cover crop of winter rye, hoping to at least get some roots into the dirt to stop the erosion. But every swing of the axe sent shocks of pain up his arms. The ground fought him. It felt dead. Water was an even bigger problem. The old well near the house was dry, filled with debris and strange, foul-smelling black mud. Every morning, Sergio had to walk 2 miles to a public creek just to haul back enough water for drinking and boiling their meager rations of potatoes and beans. On the 8th day, a black Packard motorcar rolled up the dirt track to the edge of their property. Harlan Brooks stepped out, flanked by a burly farmhand. Brooks didn't bother walking down into the depression. He stood on the ridge, looking down at Sergio, who was waist, deep in a trench, trying to pry out a massive limestone boulder. "Having fun, Grant?" Brooks called out, his voice echoing in the hollow. Sergio wiped the sweat and dirt from his forehead, leaning heavily on his iron crowbar. He didn't answer. "I drove out to make you a generous offer," Brooks continued, lighting a cigar. "I see you've realized the impossible task you've bought for yourself. The county told me about the deed. You have no water rights to the western stream, and your well is dead. I'm expanding my cattle run. I need a place to dump my slaughterhouse offal. I'll give you $50 for the deed right now. You take your wife and go find work in Chicago." Sergio stared up at the man. $50, a massive loss, but $50 would buy them train tickets and food. It was an escape from this living hell. He looked back at the ruined cabin, where Martha was currently attempting to patch a hole in the wall with mud and straw. The price was $185, Sergio called back, his voice hoarse. "I'm not selling for $50. Then you'll die here for nothing," Brooks spat, turning on his heel. "When the winter hits, Grant, you'll be begging me to take it for $20. The car roared to life and sped away, leaving Sergio in a cloud of choking dust. Driven by a sudden, irrational anger, Sergio gripped the crowbar and drove it under the stubborn limestone boulder with all his might. He threw his entire body weight against the iron bar, screaming in frustration. The heavy rock shifted. He pushed harder, his muscles screaming, the crowbar bending under the immense pressure. With a sickening crack, the boulder dislodged, rolling backward into the dirt. Sergio fell to his knees, gasping for air. But as the dust settled, his breath hitched. Where the boulder had been sitting, there was a hole. Not a natural sinkhole, but a perfectly circular, man-made shaft, lined with crumbling brick. A heavy, rusted iron grate had been shoved over the opening, and the massive boulder had been deliberately rolled on top of it to conceal it. Sergio scrambled to the edge, peering into the darkness. A rush of cold, damp air hit his face. It smelled of deep earth and fresh water. He ran to the cabin, grabbing a kerosene lantern and a heavy coil of rope. Martha watched him with wide eyes. "Sergio? What is it?" "I don't know," he panted, lighting the lantern. "But I think old man Miller was hiding something. The descent was treacherous." Sergio tied the rope securely to the stump of a dead oak tree and lowered himself into the brick-lined shaft, the kerosene lantern swinging from his belt. The shaft dropped roughly 20 feet straight down before opening up into a wider, cavernous space. When Sergio's boots finally hit solid ground, he unhooked the lantern and held it high. The yellow light pushed back the darkness, revealing something that made his heart stop in his chest. He wasn't standing in a natural cave. He was standing in a massive, subterranean aqueduct. The walls were carved directly out of the bedrock, reinforced with heavy timber bracing that, surprisingly, showed very little rot. Beneath his feet, a shallow but fast-moving stream of crystal-clear water rushed over a bed of smooth river stones. But it wasn't just the water. As Sergio walked further down the tunnel, the light illuminated row upon row of thick, glass-lined clay pipes, some shattered, but many still intact. They ran parallel to the water, leading deeper beneath the 40-acre farm. "What is this place?" Sergio whispered to the echoing darkness. He followed the tunnel for what felt like 100 yards. The air grew warmer, holding a strange, sharp scent like sulfur and something sweet, almost like molasses. At the end of the tunnel, the stream pooled into a massive underground reservoir. Above the reservoir, the ceiling of the cavern was covered in thick, creeping roots that had breached the bedrock, dangling down to drink from the pristine water. Then, Sergio saw it. Sitting on a raised stone plinth in the center of the cavern, perfectly preserved in the dry, cold air just above the waterline, were dozens of wooden crates, stamped with faded black ink. Sergio waded through the knee-deep, freezing water, his hands trembling as he reached the plinth. He pried the lid off the nearest crate with his pocket knife. It wasn't gold. It wasn't money. It was seed. Millions of them. But these were unlike any seeds Sergio, a lifelong farmer, had ever seen. They were large, dark, and hard as pebbles. Beside the crate sat a heavy leather-bound ledger, covered in dust. Sergio brushed off the cover and opened it. The handwriting inside was erratic, frantic. The ink slashed across the pages. It belonged to Josiah Miller, dated 1897. Sergio began to read, his eyes widening with every paragraph. Old man Miller hadn't gone mad. He had discovered a natural geothermal spring deep beneath his property. The water, infused with heavy minerals and natural sulfur, was completely isolated from the local water table. But more importantly, Miller had brought something back from his travels to the Far East before settling in Iowa. The Black Lotus wheat, the journal called it. A highly experimental, resilient, and incredibly nutrient-dense strain of winter grain that thrived in highly acidic soil. In fact, it required the toxic, ashy soil of the Devil's Dustpan to germinate, feeding off the sulfur and minerals drawn up by the geothermal water. Miller had engineered the entire farm above ground to look dead and ruined, sabotaging the topsoil to perfectly balance the acidity needed for this miraculous crop. He was preparing to plant his first massive harvest and revolutionize agriculture when he contracted a sudden, fatal case of pneumonia. Knowing he was dying and paranoid that the local banks would steal his life's work, Miller deliberately caused a cave-in, sealed the aqueduct, rolled a boulder over the main shaft, and poisoned his own well to ensure no one would ever want the land. He had taken his secret to the grave, until now. Sergio slammed the book shut. He looked at the water. He looked at the crates of seeds. A slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. The land wasn't cursed. It was a perfectly engineered, massive incubator waiting to be turned on. When Sergio finally climbed out of the shaft hours later, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined valley. Martha was pacing near the hole, frantic. "Sergio!" "Thank God," she cried, grabbing his arms. "What's down there?" "Our future, Martha," Sergio said, pulling her into a tight embrace, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We aren't leaving. We are going to grow." The very next morning, Sergio went to work with a manic energy. Following the intricate diagrams in Miller's journal, he located the buried release valves, hidden beneath the collapsed barn. It took him 2 days of back-breaking labor to unseize the rusted iron wheels, but when he finally threw his weight against the main lever, the ground beneath their feet actually rumbled. Deep below, the diverted geothermal spring was unleashed. The pressurized mineral water rushed into the intricate, century-old irrigation pipes hidden just 3 feet beneath the hard, cracked surface of the 40 acres. Within a week, the grey, dead soil began to change. The subterranean water seeped upward, softening the clay, warming the earth from below despite the freezing November temperatures settling over Iowa. Sergio and Martha worked under the cover of darkness, planting the bizarre, dark seeds exactly as Miller's ledger instructed. By day, they maintained the illusion of misery. Sergio continued to swing his pickaxe at rocks near the road, playing the part of the foolish, failing farmer whenever Harlan Brooks' black motorcar drove past to inspect his miserable neighbor. It wasn't until late December, when the rest of Black Hawk County was buried under a foot of dead, white snow, that the secret could no longer be kept. Harlan Brooks was driving back from a county board meeting, a smug smile on his face. He had just convinced the local bank to prepare foreclosure papers on 3 more struggling farms. As his car crested the eastern ridge, passing the Devil's Dustpan, Brooks glanced out the window, expecting to see Sergio Grant's frozen corpse. Instead, Brooks slammed on the brakes, sending his car skidding sideways into a snowbank. He stumbled out of the car, his jaw dropping open, his cigar falling from his lips into the snow. There, in the dead of winter, sitting inside the sunken protective bowl of the 40-acre depression, was a massive, impossibly vibrant sea of emerald green. While the rest of the world was frozen solid, Sergio Grant's fields were exploding with waist-high, thick-stalked wheat, radiating a faint, warm mist into the freezing air. Brooks stared, his mind fracturing at the sheer impossibility of the sight. The worst farm in Iowa, a toxic wasteland he had mocked, was alive, and Sergio Grant, standing on the porch of his newly repaired cabin with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, was looking right up at him. The frozen wind howled across the plains of Black Hawk County, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees and driving the snow into blinding drifts. Yet, inside the sunken bowl of the Devil's Dustpan, the air was entirely different. A faint, ghostly steam rose from the dark earth, catching the pale winter sunlight. The geothermal springs coursing through Josiah Miller's century-old subterranean pipes kept the ground at a steady, humid 65 degrees, creating a microclimate that defied the brutal Iowa winter. Harlan Brooks stood knee-deep in a snowbank by the county road, his expensive leather boots freezing solid, unable to tear his eyes away from the impossible sight. 40 acres of thick, black-stalked wheat swayed gently in the warm updrafts, the heavy heads of grain bursting with dark, nutrient-rich kernels. "Grant!" Brooks roared, his voice cracking over the howling wind. He scrambled down the steep, snowy embankment, slipping and sliding until he hit the invisible thermal boundary. The sudden shift in temperature made him gasp. He ripped off his heavy wool gloves, staring at the rich emerald leaves. "What kind of devilry is this? What have you done?" Sergio set down his tin coffee cup on the porch rail and walked slowly toward the property line. He wore only a light flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from months of relentless labor. "Just farming, Mr. Brooks," Sergio said, his voice maddeningly calm. "I told you I'd take my chances." "This is a trick," Brooks snarled, grabbing a handful of the wheat and crushing it in his fist. He stared at the dark, heavy grains in his palm. They were twice the size of standard spring wheat, exuding a faint, earthy aroma. "Nothing grows here. The soil is poison. You're piping in steam from somewhere. You're hiding boilers." "You're trespassing, Harlan," Sergio interrupted, his tone shifting from polite to iron-hard. "Get off my land, before I fetch the shotgun." Brooks sneered, his face flushed red with a mixture of rage and overwhelming greed. He shoved the crushed wheat grains deep into his coat pocket. "You think you've won, dirt scratcher? You think a freak patch of winter weed makes you a king? We'll see how long this lasts." He turned and trudged back up the snowy incline, shivering violently as he crossed back into the freezing winter air. Sergio watched him leave, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew a man like Harlan Brooks wouldn't simply walk away. That week, Sergio and Martha began the harvest. Without money for a mechanical combine, they worked by hand, swinging heavy iron scythes from dawn until dusk. It was back-breaking, agonizing work, but the sheer volume of the yield fueled their adrenaline. The Black Lotus wheat was unlike anything they had ever touched. The stalks were incredibly dense, and the grain milled easily into a rich, dark flour that smelled faintly of molasses. News of the miracle of the dustpan spread like a prairie fire. By late January, local farmers began parking their rusted Model T Fords along the ridge just to stare at the impossible green oasis. And with the farmers came the businessmen. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a mud-splattered sedan pulled up to the Grant cabin. A sharp-featured man in a tailored tweed suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. He tipped his fedora to Martha, who was washing clothes in a galvanized tub on the porch. "Morning, ma'am." "Arthur Pendleton," the man said, producing a stark, white business card. "I represent the Pioneer High-Bred Corn Company down in Des Moines. Mr. Henry A. Wallace himself sent me. We've been hearing some frankly unbelievable rumors about a winter wheat harvesting in January. I had to see it with my own eyes." Sergio emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. He knew the name Henry Wallace. Everyone in Iowa agriculture did. Wallace was an obsessive innovator in crop genetics, a man who would soon become the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. If Wallace was interested, this was no longer a local spectacle. It was a gold rush. Pendleton spent 3 hours examining the soil, testing the water from the creek, and analyzing the harvested grain with a portable chemistry kit. When he finally looked up, his hands were trembling. "Mr. Grant," Pendleton breathed, staring at a vial of crushed grain. "The protein content in this wheat is staggering. It's almost 30% higher than the turkey red strain everyone relies on, and it's thriving in soil that registers a pH level so acidic it should strip the rust off a tractor. How are you doing this?" "Hard work and good seed," Sergio replied evasively, protecting the secret of the geothermal aqueduct. Pendleton didn't press him. "I am authorized by Mr. Wallace to offer you an exclusive purchasing contract. We want your entire harvest for genetic study and seed stock. We will pay you $3 a bushel." Martha gasped, dropping a wet shirt back into the tub. In 1934, standard wheat was selling for roughly 38 cents a bushel. $3 a bushel for a 40-acre yield producing nearly 60 bushels an acre was a fortune. It was over $7,000. It was enough to buy mechanical equipment, rebuild the house, and never go hungry again. "Deal," Sergio said, shaking Pendleton's hand. But as Pendleton drove away to draft the bank drafts, Sergio couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. He looked up at the ridge. Parked in the distance, half hidden by a stand of dead pines, was Harlan Brooks's black Packard. Inside the lavish, mahogany-paneled study of his sprawling estate, Harlan Brooks hurled a crystal tumbler of whiskey against the stone fireplace. The glass shattered into 100 glittering pieces. "Useless," Brooks screamed, slamming his fists onto his massive oak desk. Standing nervously before him was his head agronomist, a twitchy man named Higgins. On the desk sat a dozen terracotta planting pots. Inside each pot was premium, nutrient-rich, perfectly fertilized topsoil. And in every single pot, the dark seeds Brooks had stolen from Sergio Grant's field had rotted into a foul-smelling gray sludge. "I don't understand it, Mr. Brooks," Higgins stammered, backing away from the furious landowner. "We gave them the best water, the best greenhouse temperatures, the finest loam in the county. The seed just dies. It literally digests itself. It's as if the genetics of the grain reject healthy soil." Brooks sank into his leather chair, his mind racing. He had spent 3 weeks trying to cultivate the stolen grain, planning to patent the winter strain himself and crush Grant. But the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the seed. It was the devil's dustpan itself. Grant hadn't just found a magic crop. He had unlocked a symbiotic relationship between that cursed, highly acidic, sulfur-rich soil and the mutated seed. To grow the wheat, you didn't just need the grain. You needed the 40 acres of the Miller Tract. "I want that land," Brooks whispered, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. "I want it now." The next morning, Brooks walked through the heavy brass doors of the First National Bank of Waterloo. He bypassed the tellers and strode directly into the office of the bank president, an old drinking buddy named Cornelius Taft. Brooks laid a thick stack of $100 bills on Taft's polished desk. "I need a favor, Cornelius," Brooks said smoothly, lighting a cigar. "I need you to dig into the county archives. I want every deed, every tax record, every scrap of paper related to the Miller Tract out on the Eastern Ridge." Taft raised an eyebrow, greedily eyeing the cash. "Grant bought it fair and square at the county auction. Harlan." The title was cleared of back taxes. "It's airtight." "Nothing is airtight if you look hard enough," Brooks countered, blowing a cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Josiah Miller built heavy infrastructure on that land back in 1896. Barns, windmills, deep irrigation. He had to buy the iron and timber from somewhere. Find me an unpaid debt. Find me a loophole the county clerk missed. I don't care what it takes." It took Taft's clerks 3 days of digging through dusty, rat-infested basement archives, but they found the silver bullet Brooks was praying for. It was a faded, water-damaged ledger from the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, dated November 1897. Josiah Miller had purchased $3,000 worth of industrial cast-iron piping and steam valves on credit, just months before his death. The debt had never been settled. Furthermore, A mechanic's lien had been placed on the physical property, the land itself, by the Ironworks Company. Because the lien was filed in a separate commercial registry and the land had sat abandoned for 35 years, the county auctioneer had completely missed it when transferring the deed to Sergio Grant. Legally, the debt was still attached to the dirt. With 35 years of compounding interest, the lien now totaled an astronomical $12,000. Brooks didn't just smile, he laughed aloud. He immediately bought the debt from the defunct Ironworks Company's liquidator for pennies on the dollar, transferring the lien directly into his own name. On the very day Arthur Pendleton was scheduled to arrive with the Pioneer hybrid transport trucks to collect Sergio's golden harvest, a different vehicle pulled up to the Devil's Dustpan. It was a county sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Cobb, a man who had long been in Harlan Brooks's pocket, stepped out of the car. He walked down into the warm, humid bowl of the farm, his boots crunching on the gravel. Sergio and Martha were standing by a towering pile of burlap sacks, each filled to the brim with Black Lotus wheat, waiting for the Pioneer trucks. "Morning, Sergio," Cobb said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. He pulled a thick, legal document from his jacket. "What's this, Sheriff?" Sergio asked, wiping his brow. "It's a writ of attachment," Cobb said, handing over the papers. "Turns out, the county made a mistake at the auction. There's a 1,897 mechanics lien on this land for unpaid industrial piping. The current holder of the debt is calling it in. You owe $12,000, payable immediately." Martha let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Sergio stared at the paper, the words blurring before his eyes. 12,000? That's impossible. I bought this land free and clear. Take it up with the judge, Cobb shrugged. But until the debt is paid, this property and everything on it, including that harvested grain, is legally seized. You cannot sell a single bushel. A black Packard rolled to a stop on the ridge above them. Harlan Brooks stepped out, leaning against the hood of his car, watching the scene unfold with a look of absolute triumph. Sergio looked from the legal papers in his hand to Brooks on the hill, and then to the bags of grain that represented their salvation. The trap had sprung. Brooks had found the fatal flaw in his perfect sanctuary, and he was about to steal the greatest agricultural discovery of the century right out from under them. The heavy rumble of the Pioneer hybrid transport trucks echoed over the eastern ridge, a sound that should have signaled the end of Sergio and Martha's suffering. Instead, it was the rhythm of a funeral march. Arthur Pendleton stepped out of the lead truck, his cheerful demeanor evaporating the moment he saw Sheriff Cobb standing guard over the meticulously stacked burlap sacks of Black Lotus wheat. "What is the meaning of this?" Pendleton demanded, his tailored overcoat flapping in the icy wind. "I have a legally binding contract for this grain, signed by Mr. Grant." Sheriff Cobb tipped his hat, flashing a badge that caught the pale winter sun. "Sorry, Mr. Pendleton. This property, and everything currently sitting on it, is subject to a writ of attachment. Mr. Grant here has an outstanding mechanics lien of $12,000. Until it's settled, this grain is county evidence. You load one sack onto those trucks, and I'll arrest you for theft of seized assets." Pendleton turned to Sergio, his eyes wide with shock. "Sergio? Is this true? $12,000? Sergio stood rigid, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Martha was weeping silently on the porch. "It's a trick, Arthur. An old debt from 1,897, dug up by Harlan Brooks. He bought the paper just to choke us out." Pendleton sighed, a look of profound regret washing over his face. He was a businessman, and Pioneer hybrid, despite Henry A. Wallace's noble agricultural ambitions, could not afford to entangle itself in local county corruption and seized assets. "I am deeply sorry, Sergio. My hands are tied. If the title isn't clear, we can't buy. If you can lift the lien, call me. The offer stands. But until then," Pendleton didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He signaled to the drivers, and the convoy of trucks slowly reversed, crawling back over the ridge and leaving the Devil's Dustpan in deafening silence. Up on the hill, Harlan Brooks laughed, the sound carrying down into the sunken valley like a physical blow. He climbed into his Packard and drove away, knowing he had effectively starved the Grants into submission. That night, the cabin was suffocatingly quiet. The geothermal heat radiating from the floorboards felt less like a miracle and more like a mockery. "What do we do?" Martha whispered, her hands trembling as she poured chicory coffee into chipped tin mugs. "We don't have $12, let alone 12,000. They're going to take it all. The land, the seed. Brooks is going to win." "No," Sergio said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He stared into the flickering flames of the wood stove, his eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying resolve. "He thinks because we're dirt poor, We're stupid. He thinks the law only works for men who can buy the judge. The next morning, Sergio walked the 10 miles into downtown Waterloo. His boots were worn through the soles, his coat threadbare, but he walked with the posture of a man going to war. He bypassed the wealthy, marble-fronted law firms near the courthouse. He knew those men golfed with Harlan Brooks. Instead, he found a cramped, dusty office above a haberdashery. The gold-leaf lettering on the frosted glass door was peeling. Elias Donovan, attorney at law. Donovan was a young, brilliant, but severely underfunded lawyer who had made a habit of taking on losing cases for tenant farmers. He sat behind a desk piled high with foreclosure notices, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. Sergio laid out the entire story, omitting only the secret of the underground aqueduct. He explained the auction, the miraculous winter wheat, the pioneer contract, and the sudden, impossibly old mechanic's lien. Donovan scrubbed a hand over his tired face, pulling the county records Sergio had brought. A mechanic's lien from 1,897, Donovan muttered, shaking his head. Brooks is a snake, but he's a clever one. When you buy a property at a tax auction, it usually clears standard debts. But a mechanic's lien is attached to the physical improvements, the iron pipes, the valves. If those fixtures are still in the ground, and the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company never filed a release, the debt technically survives the tax sale. Can we fight it? Sergio asked, leaning forward. In front of Judge Harrison? Not a chance, Donovan said grimly. Harrison owes his seat to Brooks' political machine. He'll uphold the lien. But, Donovan paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the 1,897 ledger copy. The law is very specific. The lien is on the fixtures, the piping, not the dirt, not the seeds. The problem is, Brooks has weaponized the debt to freeze the whole estate. So, what's our play? Sergio asked. Delay, Donovan replied. I'll file an injunction to dispute the compounded interest. It won't win the case, but it will tie Brooks up in court for a month. It gives you time, Sergio. But time to do what, I have no idea. February brought a brutal freeze that turned the rest of Iowa into a desolate landscape of ice and misery. But down in the Devil's Dustpan, the Black Lotus wheat remained a vibrant, thriving anomaly. Harlan Brooks, furious at Donovan's legal injunction delaying his outright seizure of the farm, took drastic measures. He hired 3 off-duty deputies, thugs with badges, to camp in a shack on the ridge. They worked in rotating shifts, keeping a 2-4-hour watch over the Grant property. Their orders were clear. If Sergio attempted to move a single grain of wheat off the property, they were to arrest him and confiscate the cargo. Sergio and Martha were effectively prisoners on their own land. We're caged, Martha said one evening, peering through the burlap curtains at the glow of the deputy's campfire on the hill. Even if we win the court case, Brooks will just find another way. He has the money to starve us out. Sergio didn't answer. He was staring at the floorboards, his mind racing back to the dark, humid cavern beneath their feet. The lien is on the fixtures. The piping. Donovan's words echoed in his head. Martha, Sergio said suddenly, standing up, keep the main lamps on. If anyone looks down, make sure they see my shadow moving past the window. Without another word, Sergio slipped out the back door into the freezing shadows, making his way to the concealed shaft beneath the collapsed barn. He descended the rope in pitch darkness, not daring to light his kerosene lantern until he was 50 feet down in the subterranean aqueduct. The rushing water echoed off the stone walls. Sergio waded through the frigid stream, making his way to the central reservoir and the stone plinth where he had found Josiah Miller's ledger. He had read the ledger a dozen times, memorizing the planting cycles and soil requirements. But now, he needed something else. He needed to understand the machinery Brooks was using to steal his farm. Sergio traced the massive, cast-iron pipes that diverted the geothermal spring up toward the surface. He followed them deeper into the cavern, into a narrow, unmapped tunnel that Miller had blasted out of the bedrock. At the end of the tunnel, Sergio found a heavy iron door, rusted but intact. He threw his weight against it, the metal groaning in protest before giving way. Inside was a small, brick-lined pump house, directly beneath the center of the 40 acres. Dominating the room was a massive, terrifyingly complex manifold of valves, pressure gauges, and cast-iron wheels. It was the heart of the system Miller had bought on credit in 1897. But it was what was drawn on the chalk slate on the wall that made Sergio's heart hammer against his ribs. Miller hadn't just built an irrigation system, he had built a fail-safe. Above the main manifold were a series of specific instructions, written in Miller's frantic, slashed handwriting. In the event of compromise, the earth must reclaim the heat. Turn valve C to the red mark. Open the release. The water will return to the deep aquifer. The surface will freeze in 12 hours. The soil will sour instantly. Sergio touched the cold iron of valve C. It was massive, requiring a heavy iron wrench to turn. If he opened it, the geothermal water would bypass the surface pipes completely. The devil's dustpan would instantly lose its heat. The acidic soil, without the flushing action of the mineral spring, would become toxic overnight. The Black Lotus wheat would die, and the land would revert to the barren, cursed wasteland it had been for 35 years. He could destroy it all. If he couldn't have it, neither could Brooks. But Sergio Grant was a farmer, not an arsonist. He didn't want to destroy the miracle. He wanted to save it. An audacious, impossibly risky plan began to form in his mind. He didn't just need to beat Harlan Brooks in court. He needed to completely devalue the prize Brooks was fighting for, while simultaneously securing his own fortune. He ran his hand along the cavern wall, feeling a draft of fresh air coming from a narrow, upward-sloping fissure. He followed the fissure for an hour, crawling on his belly through the damp limestone, until he saw a sliver of moonlight. He pushed away a pile of loose brush and found himself outside. He looked around, orienting himself. He was nearly 2 miles away from the farm, well outside the property line, and completely out of sight of Brooks's guards. He had found a back door. The next night, under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, Sergio used the hidden fissure to leave the farm. He walked 3 miles to a public telephone line at a deserted Crossroads general store. He deposited a nickel, his fingers numb with cold, and asked the operator to connect him to Des Moines. He needed to speak to Arthur Pendleton. "Arthur," Sergio said when the groggy pioneer hybrid agent finally answered the line. "I know you can't buy the grain on my land. But what if the grain isn't on my land anymore? And what if I can sell you something far more valuable than the harvest?" "Sergio, it's 3 in the morning, Pendleton stammered. "What are you talking about? The sheriff has your farm locked down. I can get the seed out. Not the harvest, Arthur. The master seed. The original genetics from 1897, Sergio pressed, his voice urgent. "And I can give you the exact soil chemistry formula to replicate the growth conditions anywhere in the country. But I need you to come to Waterloo tomorrow night. And you have to come alone." The blizzard raging across Black Hawk County provided the perfect cover. Sergio Grant hauled 2 heavy, iron-bound crates through the subterranean limestone fissure, his muscles screaming against the awkward weight. He had padded the crates with heavy burlap to muffle the sound, dragging them through the narrow, freezing tunnel until he finally breached the surface 2 miles away from the Devil's Dustpan. Waiting idly on the desolate, snow-whipped crossroads was Arthur Pendleton's idling sedan. The pioneer hybrid agent stepped out, pulling his fedora low against the driving snow. "Sergio," Pendleton called out, his breath pluming in the icy air. "I'm here. What is this about? If the sheriff catches us..." "The sheriff only cares about what's growing on Harlan Brooks' frozen dirt," Sergio said, dropping the crates into the snow with a heavy thud. He pried off the lids with his crowbar. Inside, protected from the elements, were thousands of the original, unplanted master seeds from 1897, alongside Josiah Miller's leather-bound ledger. Pendleton pulled a flashlight from his coat and shined it into the crates, his eyes widening. He carefully picked up the ledger, flipping through the frantic, detailed chemical equations and soil acidity charts. "The lien Brooks bought is attached to the physical farm and the iron fixtures buried beneath it," Sergio explained, shouting over the howling wind. "It covers the land and the harvest currently rooted in that soil, but it doesn't cover my personal property. It doesn't cover these seeds, which I found, not grew. And it certainly doesn't cover Josiah Miller's intellectual property." Pendleton stared at the ledger, realizing the magnitude of what Sergio was offering. "This formula, this dictates exactly how to synthesize the soil conditions. We wouldn't need your farm, Sergio. We could replicate this in a laboratory environment. We could breed the Black Lotus strain anywhere." "Exactly," Sergio said, his eyes hard and unblinking. "Brooks wants the dirt. Let him have it. I want to sell you the patent rights to the Black Lotus wheat, the original master seed stock, and the formula to grow it. And I want $50,000 for it. Cashier's check, drawn on a Des Moines bank, far out of Brooks's reach. In 1934, $50,000 was an astronomical fortune, a king's ransom. But Pendleton was a visionary, and he knew Henry A. Wallace would recognize this as the agricultural holy grail. The ability to grow high-protein wheat in acidic, desolate soil during the height of the Great Depression was priceless. "Deal," Pendleton said without a second of hesitation. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a pre-signed corporate draft book, and wrote the check on the hood of the car, shielding it from the snow. Sergio folded the stiff paper, slipping it into his breast pocket close to his heart. The weight of his poverty, the fear of starvation, and the dread of Harlan Brooks's tyranny evaporated in the freezing wind. He had won, but there was one final task remaining. After Pendleton's taillights disappeared into the storm, Sergio crawled back into the subterranean fissure. He navigated the pitch-black tunnels until he reached the brick-lined pump house directly beneath his farm. He stood before the massive iron manifold. Above him, on the surface, 40 acres of miracle wheat swayed in the artificial warmth. He thought of the back-breaking hours he and Martha had spent swinging scythes, tending the earth, bringing the dead land back to life. It broke his heart to do it. Sergio gripped the heavy iron wrench and fitted it over valve C. With a guttural shout, he threw his entire body weight against the rusted iron. The metal shrieked, a deafening grind that echoed through the cavern. He pushed harder, his boots slipping on the wet stone, until the valve gave way. He spun the wheel until it locked into the red marker. Instantly, the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the aqueduct changed. The pressurized water rushing up toward the surface pipes was abruptly violently rerouted. A massive torrent of geothermal water flushed downward, bypassing the farm completely and dumping back into the deep, subterranean aquifer. The heat stopped. Sergio stood in the dark, listening to the pipes above him drain empty. The fail-safe had been triggered. The earth would now reclaim the warmth. He turned and walked away, leaving the devil's dustpan to its inevitable fate. The morning of the eviction dawned with a brutal, biting ferocity. The sky was a bruised, unforgiving purple, heavy with the promise of more snow, while the wind howled across the desolate Iowa plains like a starving animal. Inside the heated cabin of Sheriff Cobb's county cruiser, however, Harlan Brooks felt nothing but the warm, intoxicating glow of absolute victory. He rode in the passenger seat, his heavy, fur-lined coat unbuttoned, a smug and triumphant smile plastered across his face. In his gloved, immaculate hand, he held the official foreclosure order signed just hours prior by Judge Harrison. Elias Donovan's desperate little injunction had finally run its pathetic course, and the law had firmly, predictably, sided with the millionaire. The $12,000 mechanic's lien had defaulted. The 40 acres of the Miller tract and every single miraculous stalk of Black Lotus wheat currently rooted in its soil now legally belonged to Harlan Brooks. He looked over his shoulder through the rear window. Trailing behind the cruiser were two massive, heavy-duty grain transport trucks he had hired from Waterloo for the occasion. He had already calculated the profits in his head. "I'm going to make Grant watch as I load his grain onto my own trucks," Brooks gloated, striking a match and lighting a thick Cuban cigar. The pungent, expensive smoke quickly filled the cramped car. "Every last bushel. I want him to see his salvation driven away. Then I'm going to burn that pathetic, drafty cabin to the ground. Clear the site for a proper foreman's quarters." Sheriff Cobb, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the tires slipped on patches of black ice, chuckled nervously. He didn't particularly enjoy destroying a man's livelihood, but Brooks paid far better than the county ever could. He put up a good fight, Mr. Brooks. Have to give the man credit for lasting this long. But nobody beats you in this county. Nobody. A peasant fighting a king is still just a peasant, Cobb, Brooks murmured, taking a long drag from his cigar. The small convoy began the steep, winding ascent up the eastern ridge. Brooks leaned forward in his seat, his heart hammering with a sudden, greedy thrill. He was eager to feast his eyes on his new emerald-green empire. He imagined the steam rising from the sunken bowl, the impossible warmth defying the lethal winter, the heavy heads of grain waiting to be threshed and sold to the highest bidder. The cruiser crested the top of the ridge, the headlights sweeping across the snow-packed rim of the Devil's Dustpan. Brooks smiled, looking down into the valley. But as the scene below came into sharp, horrifying focus, Brooks's smile vanished. The muscles in his face went completely slack, his jaw parted, and the lit Cuban cigar slipped from his trembling fingers, tumbling unnoticed onto the rubber floorboards of the police cruiser, where it began to singe the mat. "Stop the car," Brooks whispered, his face draining of all color until it matched the surrounding snow. He grabbed the dashboard, his knuckles turning white. "Stop the car," Cobb, startled by the sudden panic in the millionaire's voice, slammed his heavy boot onto the brakes. The cruiser skidded sideways, the tires locking up on the icy ridge before sliding to a violent halt dangerously close to the embankment. The transport trucks behind them honked, their air brakes hissing as they narrowly avoided a collision. But Brooks didn't notice the near miss. He was staring down into the depression, his mind violently rejecting the reality before his eyes. The Devil's Dustpan was gone. The miraculous, steaming bowl of warm air that had sheltered the 40 acres had entirely vanished. The invisible, protective thermal boundary that had kept the freezing winds at bay had collapsed. Without the continuous, vital flow of the alkaline geothermal water warming it from below, the highly acidic, sulfur-rich topsoil had violently reacted to the sub-zero temperatures. The lush, waist-high sea of emerald wheat was no more. It had completely liquefied. The valley floor was now a blackened, rotting expanse of frozen sludge. The soil itself had turned a sickly, ashen grey, cracked and fissured like a dry riverbed, exuding a faint, terrible smell of dead sulfur and decaying plant matter that drifted up to the ridge on the winter wind. Brooks scrambled out of the passenger door, ignoring the biting wind that immediately tore at his clothes. He ran down the steep, icy embankment, his expensive leather boots sinking deep into the foul, freezing mud. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the center of the ruined field. Frantically, he grabbed a handful of the blackened, rotting sludge that had once been worth a fortune. It dissolved into freezing, acidic ash in his bare hands, slipping through his fingers like dirty water. "No, no, this is impossible," Brooks screamed, his voice cracking as he looked frantically around the dead, barren wasteland. The silence of the dead valley mocked him. Where is the heat? Where is the crop? He spun around, looking toward the ruined farmhouse. Standing calmly on the porch of the cabin, untouched by the frantic despair radiating from the fields, was Sergio Grant. He was wearing a heavy, brand-new wool coat, the fabric thick and warm. Beside him stood Martha, wrapped in a beautiful, fur-lined shawl, looking healthier and more rested than Brooks had ever seen her. At their feet sat two freshly packed, high-quality leather suitcases. "Morning, Harlan," Sergio called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the howling frozen wind, steady and entirely devoid of fear. Brooks hauled himself up from the sludge, his pristine coat ruined, his face flushed purple with an unhinged, screaming rage. He charged toward the cabin, pointing a shaking finger at the farmer. "What did you do, Grant? You poisoned it," Brooks roared, spit flying from his lips. "I'll have you arrested for destruction of property. I'll see you rot in a federal penitentiary." "It's not my property anymore, Harlan," Sergio said calmly, taking a slow step down from the wooden porch. "You saw to that. You bought the lien. You bought the pipes. You bought the dirt. And as you told me the very first day we met outside the courthouse, the dirt is a graveyard. The wheat." Brooks stammered, his chest heaving as he gestured wildly at the liquefied remains of his fortune. It was surviving. It was a miracle. It was surviving because of a delicate, subterranean geothermal system built by Josiah Miller. "A fail-safe system I shut off entirely last night," Sergio said, his eyes locking onto Brooks' panicked, wide-eyed gaze. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words struck like a hammer. "You wanted the farm so badly, Harlan. You didn't bother to ask how it worked. You just assumed you could steal the final product. That soil is naturally toxic. Without the hot mineral spring continuously flushing the acid from the roots, it killed the crop in less than 12 hours. Sheriff Cobb, who had jogged down the hill behind Brooks, looked at the dead fields in utter confusion. He pulled his heavy coat tighter against the bitter cold. "Sergio, you ruined a $12,000 asset. This was court-ordered. You're still on the hook for the original debt." "No, Sheriff," Sergio replied. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his new wool coat and pulled out a piece of crisp, stiff paper. It was a certified copy of a bank deposit slip. "I don't owe anyone a dime, because I don't own the land. Mr. Brooks here demanded the court transfer the deed this morning to satisfy his mechanic's lien. He succeeded. He now owns 40 acres of the most useless, toxic soil in the state of Iowa, and he paid $12,000 of his own money to get it." Brooks stared at Sergio, a horrific, paralyzing realization washing over him. The trap had closed, but he was the one caught in its steel jaws. He had paid off a massive, ancient corporate debt just to seize the land, assuming the miracle crop would pay for it 100 times over. Now, the crop was dead, the land was poisoned, and he was holding the bag on a worthless, unfarmable crater that would bleed his finances dry. "You have nothing," Brooks spat, though his voice was now trembling with a sickening mixture of rage and mounting terror. "You destroyed the crop, but you're still a penniless dirt scratcher. You have nowhere to go." Sergio smiled. It wasn't a smirk or a sneer. It was a slow, genuinely happy smile of a man who had finally broken his chains. "Actually, Harlan, I sold the intellectual property rights, the original master seed stock, and Josiah Miller's soil chemistry formula to Pioneer Hybrid last night," Sergio said, folding the paper and tucking it back into his coat, "for $50,000. Brooks physically staggered backward as if he had been shot in the chest. The last remnants of color drained from his face completely. $50,000. It was an unimaginable sum. Grant hadn't just beaten him. He had annihilated him. "Enjoy your farm, Harlan," Sergio said, tipping his hat politely. He turned, picked up the 2 leather suitcases, and took Martha's arm. Together, they walked past the dumbfounded, ruined millionaire, past the silent, wide-eyed sheriff, and began the walk up the icy ridge. A sleek, heated taxicab from Waterloo, paid for in advance, was waiting for them on the county road, its engine humming warmly as it prepared to take them to the train station, and then to a new life entirely. Harlan Brooks fell to his knees once more in the freezing, toxic mud, surrounded by the rotting, foul-smelling remains of his own insurmountable greed, listening helplessly as the engine of the cab faded away into the howling Iowa winter. The legend of the Devil's Dustpan became a whispered, cautionary tale throughout the American Midwest. Harlan Brooks, financially crippled by the massive debts he had leveraged to steal the land, eventually lost his entire agricultural empire to the very banks he had once controlled. He spent the rest of his bitter days trying in vain to restart the subterranean aqueduct, but the rusting pipes, shocked by the sudden freeze, had shattered deep within the bedrock, rendering the farm permanently barren. As for Sergio and Martha Grant, they never returned to Black Hawk County. Using their newfound fortune, they purchased a sprawling, fertile estate in the lush valleys of Oregon. The Black Lotus wheat, perfected in the laboratories of Pioneer Hybrid, went on to become a critical, resilient crop that helped save thousands of American families from starvation during the darkest, most desperate years of the Dust Bowl, proving that the greatest harvests are not born from the soil, but from the resilience of the human spirit.